there is a quiet moment that almost no one talks about. It usually doesn't happen during a fight. It doesn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It happens alone, often late at night, when someone sits with a feeling they've been carrying for years and finally admits something that feels almost unspeakable. I can't keep doing this anymore. Not because they stop caring, not because they are cold or ungrateful, but because every interaction feels like reopening a wound that never healed properly. Most people think cutting off family is an impulsive decision, something dramatic, something fueled by anger, but psychology tells a very different story. For most people who reach this point, the decision isn't loud, it's heavy, it's slow, and it's usually the last step after every other option has already failed. Here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. People don't cut off family because they are weak. They do it because they stayed strong for too long. They stayed quiet. They stayed polite. They stayed hopeful. They stayed loyal to people who kept showing them, in small but consistent ways, that their emotional needs were never going to be met. And what's fascinating is that the brain does not interpret emotional neglect as something abstract. It processes it as a threat, not a dramatic threat. Not an obvious one, but a slow erosion of safety. The human nervous system is designed to seek connection, but it is also designed to protect. When connection repeatedly becomes a source of confusion, anxiety, or self-doubt, the brain starts doing something very specific. It begins to associate familiarity with danger. This is why people who cut off family often say something that sounds confusing to outsiders. I felt calmer when I stopped talking to them. Not happier, not relieved in a celebratory way, calmer. That calm is not cruelty, it is regulation. Psychologists describe this as a form of boundary-driven survival, not rejection. The brain isn't trying to punish anyone, it's trying to restore balance. And here's where the misunderstanding deepens. Family bonds are supposed to be unconditional, but healthy psychology does not mean unlimited tolerance. There is a difference between forgiveness and continued exposure. One allows healing. The other can quietly reopen the same emotional injury over and over again. Many people who cut off family don't actually want distance. They want safety without conditions. They want conversations that don't require shrinking. They want relationships where love isn't tied to obedience. They want space where their identity isn't treated like a flaw that needs correcting. And when those needs are repeatedly dismissed, something shifts internally. At first, the mind tries compromise. Then it tries explanation. Then it tries silence, and finally it chooses absence. What's rarely discussed is how painful that absence actually is. Because cutting off family doesn't erase attachment, it suspends it. The emotional bond doesn't vanish, it goes underground. This is why people who cut off family still think about them on birthdays, still feel a quiet ache during holidays, still wonder late at night if things could ever be different. If they didn't care, it wouldn't hurt. Psychologically, this is called unresolved attachment. The relationship ends structurally but not emotionally. And that unresolved attachment often creates guilt, not because the decision was wrong, but because humans are wired to believe that loyalty equals morality. From a young age, many of us are taught that family endurance is proof of character, that staying no matter the cost is virtuous. So when someone leaves, even for self-preservation, their mind often asks a cruel question. What kind of person does this make me? This is where the internal conflict becomes intense, because on one side there is peace, and on the other there is shame, and the brain struggles to hold both. Studies on emotional boundary setting show that people who choose distance from family often experience an increase in emotional clarity, but also an increase in self-questioning. They replay conversations, they reanalyze tone, they wonder if they were too sensitive, too rigid, too demanding. But here's the psychological truth that doesn't get enough attention. People who cut off family almost always tried to stay longer than they should have. They tolerated patterns that chipped away at their sense of self. They accepted explanations that minimized their feelings. They waited for apologies that never arrived. And the final decision often comes not after one big event, but after a realization. This pattern is not changing. That realization is not dramatic. It's devastating. because it means grieving not just the relationship you had, but the one you hoped for. And grief changes how the brain processes connection. Neuroscience shows that when grief remains unresolved, the brain becomes hyper-aware of emotional risk. It learns to anticipate disappointment. So distance becomes a form of prevention, not punishment. Another misunderstood aspect is this: people assume cutting off family means erasing the past. In reality, it often means remembering it too clearly. It means recognizing patterns that once felt normal, but now feel harmful when seen through adult awareness. As children, we normalize what we are given. As adults, we name what we experienced. And naming something changes everything. What was once just how they are becomes how it affected me. That shift is powerful, and it is terrifying, because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. And that clarity forces a decision. Do I continue to participate in a dynamic that cost me my peace? Or do I accept the pain of distance in exchange for emotional stability? Neither option feels good. One just hurts less over time. Here's something rarely acknowledged. People who cut off family are often deeply relational. They care intensely. They feel deeply, which is exactly why they reach a breaking point. Emotionally detached people don't wrestle with this choice. Emotionally aware people do. The very sensitivity that makes someone compassionate also makes prolonged emotional harm unbearable. And that sensitivity doesn't turn off after the cutoff. It just redirects. Many people pour that care into friendships, chosen family, creative work, or inner growth, not because they replaced their family, but because the human need for connection never disappears. It adapts. From a psychological standpoint, this is called relational reorganization. The mind restructures where it feels safe attaching. And interestingly, people who go through this often develop stronger boundaries across all relationships. They become more intentional, more selective, more aware of early warning signs. Not colder, clearer. But there is one part of this experience that almost no one prepares you for: the loneliness. Even when the decision is right, it can feel isolating. Because society does not offer many scripts for this kind of grief. There are rituals for loss through death. There are words for breakups. There is language for divorce. But there is very little public language for grieving someone who is still alive, still reachable, but no longer emotionally safe. So people grieve quietly. They grieve in moments that catch them off guard. A familiar song, a childhood memory, a phrase that sounds like home used to sound. And sometimes they wonder if distance means failure. But psychology suggests something different. Sometimes distance is the most honest form of self-respect. Not every relationship can grow with you. Not every bond can survive awareness. And that doesn't make anyone a villain. It makes them human. There is a myth that healing means reconciliation, but healing often means integration, understanding what happened, accepting what cannot be changed, learning how to carry both love and distance without letting either define your worth. And here's where things get even more complex. People who were cut off experience their own psychological pain, confusion, rejection, loss without explanation. They may genuinely not understand what went wrong, and sometimes both experiences coexist. One person needed distance to breathe. The other experienced that distance as abandonment. Psychology does not take sides here. It examines impact. Intent does not erase effect, and effect does not erase intent. This is why family estrangement is one of the most emotionally layered experiences a human can have. It is not clean, it is not simple, and it rarely has a villain. What it has is misalignment, different emotional languages, different thresholds, different capacities for accountability. And when those differences go unaddressed for too long, silence becomes the loudest option left. But here's a question that almost everyone involved eventually asks, even if they never say it out loud. Could this ever change? Psychologically, the answer is not about time. It's about pattern interruption. Without awareness, reflection, and change behavior, time alone does not heal relational wounds. It just adds distance. And distance can either harden into permanence or soften into possibility. That outcome depends on something very specific, whether emotional safety becomes more important than being right, whether listening replaces defending, whether curiosity replaces control. Because reconciliation, when it happens, doesn't begin with contact. It begins with internal change. And for many people, that change never comes. So they learn to live with a reality that feels both peaceful and painful. A life where they are calmer, but still carrying questions. A life where they feel grounded, but sometimes incomplete. And that contradiction is not weakness. It is the cost of choosing self-preservation in a world that often rewards endurance over honesty. In the next part, we're going to explore what happens after the silence settles, how people rebuild identity after family separation, why guilt fades slower than grief, and how the brain eventually learns to hold love without proximity. Because cutting off family is not the end of the story. For most people, it's the beginning of a much quieter, deeper reckoning with who they are allowed to be when they stop explaining themselves. And that part changes everything. After the silence settles, something unexpected happens. At first, many people assume the hardest part will be the separation itself, the conversations that stop, the invitations that no longer come, the names that go quiet in their phone. But psychologically, that's only the surface layer. The deeper work begins afterward when the external noise fades and the internal dialogue gets louder. Because when family is no longer defining you, correcting you, or questioning you, a very unsettling question appears. Who am I now? For a long time, many people unconsciously organized their identity around family roles. The responsible one, the quiet one, the peacemaker, the difficult one, the one who never quite fit. These roles aren't chosen, they're assigned early, reinforced often, and rarely questioned. So when distance removes the structure that kept those roles alive, the mind enters a period psychologists call identity destabilization. Not a breakdown, a recalibration, and it can feel disorienting. People describe it as standing in a room with no mirrors. There's relief, but also uncertainty. Because without constant feedback, even harmful feedback, the brain has to learn how to self-reference. This is where guilt often intensifies. Not because the decision was wrong, but because guilt is what remains when loyalty has nowhere to go. Guilt is not always a signal of wrongdoing. Often it's a signal of conditioning. From a psychological standpoint, guilt thrives in systems where love was conditional, where approval came with rules, where belonging required compliance. So when someone steps outside that system, even for valid reasons, the emotional reflex doesn't disappear overnight. The mind says, you broke the rule, even if the rule was never fair. This is why people can feel guilt even when they are calmer, healthier, and more emotionally stable than they've ever been. The nervous system relaxes, the conscience protests, and this internal tug-of-war can last longer than expected. Research on boundary setting shows that guilt peaks not at the moment of separation, but during periods of growth afterward. When people start to feel better, because feeling better raises a question the mind isn't prepared for. If I'm okay now, why didn't I leave sooner? That question carries shame, even though it shouldn't. But shame is clever. It disguises itself as responsibility. So people replay the past not to change it, but to punish themselves for surviving it. This is where self-compassion becomes critical. Not as a motivational phrase, but as a neurological necessity. The brain cannot heal in a state of constant self-judgment. Studies show that individuals navigating family estrangement who practice self-compassion experience lower anxiety, better emotional regulation, and a stronger sense of identity over time. Not because they excuse everything, but because they stop attacking themselves for having limits. Another overlooked shift happens during this phase. People begin to recognize patterns they were trained to ignore. They notice how certain tones make their chest tighten, how certain expectations trigger an urge to explain, how silence feels safer than obligation. This awareness isn't bitterness, it's pattern recognition. And once the brain learns to recognize emotional patterns, it applies that learning everywhere. In friendships, in romantic relationships, in workplaces. This is why many people who cut off family later say something surprising. I stopped tolerating things I used to normalize. They become less patient with emotional inconsistency, less willing to overfunction for others, less likely to confuse familiarity with trust. Not because they are guarded, but because they are informed. Psychology calls this adaptive boundary generalization. Pain teaches discernment, but discernment can feel lonely, because as standards rise, circles often shrink, and that shrinking can feel like loss, even when it's healthy. There is also a quieter grief that surfaces during milestones, birthdays, achievements, moments that once came with automatic witnesses. People often say they don't miss the relationship itself as much as they miss the idea of shared history being seen, the sense that someone remembers where you started. This is a deeply human longing. Our brains are wired to want continuity, to be known over time, so when family separation removes that thread, people often seek it elsewhere. They gravitate toward chosen family, mentors, friends who listen without rewriting their experience. This isn't replacement, it's reattachment, and reattachment is a sign of resilience, not avoidance. Attachment theory tells us that humans don't stop attaching. They attach where safety is available, and safety isn't defined by blood. It's defined by consistency, respect, and emotional presence. Still, one of the most difficult psychological tasks is letting go of the fantasy. The fantasy that one day everything will be acknowledged, that accountability will arrive, that conversations will be different. This fantasy isn't foolish, it's protective. Hope keeps people going longer than reality sometimes can, but eventually holding on to that fantasy becomes heavier than releasing it. This is where acceptance enters, not acceptance of what happened, but acceptance of what is. Acceptance does not mean agreement, it means clarity. It means understanding that you cannot heal inside the same environment that taught you to doubt yourself. And that understanding is often what finally allows guilt to soften, because guilt survives on uncertainty. When clarity arrives, guilt loses its grip. Another important psychological shift happens over time. The nervous system recalibrates. Many people don't realize how activated they were until they're no longer living inside constant emotional vigilance. They sleep deeper. Their thoughts slow down, their bodies stop bracing for impact. This is not imagined. Chronic relational stress keeps the nervous system in a heightened state. Distance allows it to return to baseline, and when the body feels safer, the mind follows. People begin to experience something they may not have felt in years. Emotional spaciousness, room to think without anticipating reaction, room to feel without minimizing, room to exist without performing. And with that space comes creativity, curiosity, and self-trust. Not overnight, gradually. But here's an uncomfortable truth. Healing does not make the story disappear. It makes it quieter. There will still be moments of wondering, moments of sadness, moments of longing. Healing is not erasure, it's integration. The ability to carry complexity without letting it consume you. To say, this mattered, and this hurt, and I chose myself, all at the same time. For people who are cut off, there is also a psychological reckoning. They may experience confusion that lingers for years. They may replay interactions searching for clarity. They may feel unfairly judged, and sometimes they truly don't understand. Not because they are cruel, but because awareness requires willingness. Self-reflection is not automatic. It's chosen, and without it, distance feels inexplicable. This is why estrangement often creates parallel griefs that never meet. Two sides holding pain that speaks different languages. And while reconciliation is sometimes possible, psychology is clear on one thing. Without changed behavior, contact reactivates old wounds. Words alone do not rebuild safety. Consistency does. So for many people, distance remains, not out of spite, out of realism. And that realism becomes easier to hold with time. As identity solidifies, people stop needing validation from the place that once withheld it. They learn to validate themselves, they learn to trust their emotional responses, to listen to discomfort without explaining it away, to honor intuition without guilt. This internal trust is one of the most profound outcomes of family separation. Because when you trust yourself, you stop searching for permission to be okay. And something else happens. Compassion expands, not necessarily toward the people involved, but toward complexity itself. People become less interested in blame and more interested in understanding. They see how generational patterns repeat, how emotional limitations are often inherited, how harm can occur without intent. This doesn't excuse behavior, but it contextualizes it, and context allows peace even without proximity. Over time, many people reach a point where they no longer feel defined by the cutoff. It becomes one chapter, not the title. They speak about it with less charge, they think about it less often, they carry it more lightly. Not because it stopped mattering, but because they stopped orbiting it. This is when life expands again. Goals feel personal instead of reactive. Relationships feel chosen instead of default. Boundaries feel natural instead of defensive. And in that expansion, something quietly profound settles in. A sense of self that isn't borrowed. A sense of worth that isn't negotiated. A sense of belonging that starts from within. This doesn't mean reconciliation won't ever happen. It means that if it does, it will come from strength, not longing. From clarity, not hope. From mutual respect, not endurance. And if it never happens, that too becomes survivable. Not because love disappeared, but because self-abandonment did. The psychology of people who cut off their family is not about rejection. It's about resolution. The resolution to stop betraying oneself in the name of peace. The resolution to choose emotional safety over appearances. The resolution to live honestly, even when honesty costs. And perhaps the most important truth of all is this. Most people who walk this path never wanted to. They wanted connection. They wanted repair. They wanted understanding. Distance was not the goal. It was the consequence of clarity. And clarity once gained changes how a person moves through the world forever. Quieter, stronger, more rooted. Not perfect, but real. And sometimes that is the most healing place a person can finally stand.